Welcome to the Modern Husbands Podcast, where any combination of Dr. Bruce Ross, Christian Sherrill, and Brian Page host national experts who share winning ideas to manage money in the home as a team. Today, we welcome Dr. Jason Frishman, who has been working for 25 years to support individuals, groups, families, organizations, and businesses. He believes that our lives are adventurous, and we can and should be an active, engaged author of our own adventure stories. Dr. Frishman is a practicing licensed therapist. He is a psychologist and doctorate with specific training in collaborative, narrative, and adventure therapies. He is the founder of Journeymen, which inspires committed, well-balanced men to successfully journey through life with responsibility, meaning, and intention. For today's show, we discuss the common mental struggles men face and strategies to overcome them. Enjoy the episode. Dr. Frishman, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, and it's great to see you all.
As the founder of Journeymen, what inspired you to focus on addressing the mental health challenges that are specific to men?
You know, it's a really good question. I think I started my career working primarily with boys, and when I was much younger, I'm embarrassed to say it now, but I was also much more naive, and I loved working with kids. And I basically said, I'm going to work with kids for the rest of my career. And, because kind of if you're an adult and a jerk, it's too late for you. I'm going to work with kids. And as as anyone who's in this field is, the more you work with kids, the more you have to work with adults. And the more I worked with adults, you see that you're talking to the moms more often, you're talking to the systems more often, and you have to work extra hard to get dads involved. And yet, I know from my own life, I know from my training, I know from friends that fathers are really important. And so working with dads and then, and subsequently men has become a real passion of mine, because I think our mental health and the way that our inner lives intersect with the social world is really powerful, and we have a lot of work to do. So I think this all comes out where I'm working more and more. As I had my own kids, I started working with older men, and I wanted to save my kid energy for my kids and our friends' kids. So I started working with older men, and just became so enthralled and interested and engaged with how men interact with their everyday world and how the world interacts with men in our development. So it's been something that I've been really passionate about for years.
That's it. Your story and kind of your progression actually really resonates with me, because I actually started out in my own master's program with the intention of working with children. And just as you said, the more you work with children, the more you have to start working with the parents and the adults. And I think my own shift kind of started resonating with parents and working with their finances and going through those struggles. But it's interesting, the more you work with children, you really have to work with the parents. You have to bring them in. You have to get both of the parents in, if possible, to really start seeing that difference.
Absolutely. And there was something I remember. I used to do school-based work, and I remember there was a point when a kid was sick, so he didn't come into school, so I didn't have a chance to work with him. So I called his mom just to chat and catch up. And that conversation, the next week when I came into school, all of his teachers were like, he came back to school and was doing really well. And, what did you do? And it wasn't anything other than supporting and validating and normalizing things for his mom. So she felt more empowered, because I'm not going to adopt the kid. Like, I want the mom and the dad and the adults in their lives to be the ones who know what to do and how to do it. And so, working with adults became it became much more interesting for me as I was able to see the impact of adults making change in the world.
And so as you've shifted kind of to working more with men and adult men, can you share some insights with us into some of the common mental struggles that you've seen with men and what they're facing in society today?
Yeah, no, that's also, it's a great question, because, training from a psychological standpoint, right? Like my initial thought would be to answer you with like, what are the more common diagnoses and what are the more common like behavioral traits that I see, and
Right.
I'm not going to quote from the diagnostic manual written by a bunch of rich white men in suits. I don't think that's as helpful for the men that we work with. A lot of the traits that I see working with men is this push and pull of, there's a desire to be more connected, there's a desire to be more present, there's a desire to be living in a meaningful life, and yet society, culture, family cultures, all the way from family cultures and above, we are systemically and systematically pushing men away from emotional expression, loving connections, relationships that are meaningful and values based. And so, working with men who, will tell me, I mean, one of the stories I share a lot is I'm sitting with a client in my office who spends 20 minutes telling me how great of a weekend he had with his buddies, doing all the things you might imagine a bunch of men and camping in the woods would be doing. And then he got quiet and he said, yeah, but if my wife left me, I'd have no one to tell. Right.
Hmm.
And ironically, or to add some depth to that story, I also had this moment where quite literally on the other side of my office door in my waiting room was a guy who I knew he was there because I've seen him for 9 years. He was always early. And if I was allowed to introduce these two men, they'd have less need of me. But I'm not, but because of confidentiality, not without a lot of paperwork and bureaucracy, would I actually be allowed to have these guys meet one another in a social way. And yet that's what I would know. That's what I know from my training and experience and whatnot. They actually needed much more than me, much more than anything that I have. Now I work with a wide range. So some of the guys that I work with are much more on a sort of extreme end of the clinical scale, where yes, working with a therapist is absolutely needed. We're talking with severe trauma and extreme anxiety or depression, all of those things absolutely valid. Those are things that we need therapy for. And yet the vast majority of guys that I work with who are feeling loneliness, they're feeling disconnected, they're feeling that they're feeling and yet the ability to express it and connect around those things is something that is it's wanting, right? We are pushed away from that. The metaphor I'll use that I've heard in different ways, but I use this one I talk a lot is, we talk in this culture about a mental health crisis. And there is one, right? Like school shootings, men have the highest level of suicide, heart attacks, all of these things. There's a mental health crisis. But I believe that this crisis is really a symptom of a bigger story and a bigger picture, right? The metaphor is, if we took a plant and put it in a room with no windows, no sunlight, and didn't water it, and it died, and we said, oh my gosh, we've got a plant health crisis, right? What we would then do in our culture is we've got to figure out a fertilizer, a good medicated fertilizer to give to the plant to live in that water-free dark room so that it can thrive. Otherwise, it's a crisis. And yet the reality is, taking the plant out of the dark room and watering it doesn't make us as much money. And it doesn't, it's not as, it doesn't satisfy a larger social, system. I can say that more simply. And yet that's really what we're doing with our boys. There's been research that shows that boys as young as 2 and 3 are being pushed away from close relationships. Boys, when they're, 13, 14, 15, are actively pushing away from male friendships, all the way up to the fact that as adults, we have a genre of movies that makes fun of men having friends with men, like bromances, right? Like we have to make fun and joke in order to make male friendships okay. And so to me, that I don't know if that's a sort of obtuse answer to your question, but I think what happens is there's a loneliness and a disconnection both to ourselves and to other communities, people, close friends, family, etc.
Yeah, it does. I mean, from your experience, why do you think it is so difficult for men to connect?
That's a big question. I think there's everything from, and this is sort of I alluded to before. I think as a culture, we have what some have called a man box culture. We have a culture of socializing and acculturating men in a certain way, where if we are emotional, if we're soft, if we're anything that looks or feels or sounds like feminine, then we're wrong. Right. And there are consequences to acting that way. There are consequences in development, in developing kids, young ones, teenagers who, if they don't follow the man box rules, then what are they called? They're called all sorts of, derogatory terms. I mean, I run a group for teenagers. And last week we had a group and we were talking about this concept, and I said, if you don't act tough, do this, whatever. These are sensitive liberal kids, to be honest. I live in a town with, this was in person. I said, if you don't act in a certain way, what do the other kids call you? And they pulled out all the words that research tells us. And these are, and so, why is it this way? I think that the way I say it is the patriarchy doesn't like men either. Right? It is within the system, our culture's system and systemic narrative, right? The narrative of masculinity and fatherhood and sort of boyhood isn't one where we are able to have a full expression of emotional connectedness and expression. If we don't have to, I'll allude to it now, we don't necessarily have to go into it, but part of it is our guiding cultural narratives are lacking. Right now, the biggest, most omnipotent guiding narrative for masculine development is the hero's journey. And, that's something that either you've heard of or if not, about, right? Like Star Wars, Lord of the Rings.
Can you explain that for our listeners?
Absolutely. The hero's journey is, it was coined by a researcher named Joseph Campbell. It is connected to Jungian studies, Carl Jung. But basically, the hero's journey is a narrative that has been seen in cultures all around the world, in mythology and folklore all around the world. Joseph Campbell called it the monomyth, basically the story to end all stories. And our modern culture has sort of adopted that hook and believed it hook, line, and sinker. Every Pixar movie, every Disney movie, and in fact, Pixar, because I know someone who worked there, they use the hero's journey worksheet to develop movies. Right. And so all of the blockbusters, all of these things, and the answer, and frankly, I do men's coaching, most men's coaching programs, most residential treatment centers for kids, they use the hero's journey as a way of guiding development. And it's useful. It's very helpful. I mean, for the first 15 years, I alluded before we started talking, my dissertation is written from the metaphor of the hero's journey. And then, as we were talking about narrative therapy, one of narrative therapy's foundational ideas is questioning taken for granted stories. So although I love the hero's journey, I had to question it, right? And I said, all right, well, to explain real quickly, I know you asked this, is the hero's journey in short is the hero gets either called out or kicked out of his home. Now, people often will write it as a her as well, but it's a very masculine energy story. So often it's men. They get called or kicked out of their home space for some quest. They go into a different realm. They have challenges and battles. They climb the mountain. They battle a dragon. They find the cave. They get the treasure. And then they do it all backwards to go home, where they're either revered as the returning hero who saves the land, or kicked out because they don't recognize him anymore because he's changed so much. And it's a powerful story. It's great. But what about everybody who stayed home? Don't they have adventure and magic and aren't the people who are home wiping butts, doing dishes, raising kids, having gardens, keeping the hearth burning? Isn't their life, can't their life be adventurous as well? Can't there be, magic in the mundane of their lives? And so when we're focused on the hero so much, what is this story? There's wonderful things in the story. and I used it as a base for my interventions for 15 years. But when we think about it as well in a different way, when we really critically look at the story, it also tells us about might makes right, black and white thinking. History is written by the victor. The king and the princes are the characters. These elements that really, I think, show us only a partial model for who we can be. And it isn't the only story. And doing a lot of the research that I've done and looking into this in a deep way, there are stories that have been literally oppressed. They've been forgotten to time and pushed away. If we think about fairy tales, the only characters that men role play in fairy tales are princes, villains, or kings, for the most part. But there are other fairy tales. I mean, I have this right here. I've read this about 10 times. It's a book called Beyond the Hero. And it talks about moving past the archetypes of masculinity that we know of, warrior, king, lover, magician, and going into other types of stories that men can embody. And yet we're not taught that. We're not shown that. We're not modeled that, because you're either epic, legendary, or a peasant. And so think about when the vast majority of men who go to work, come home, take care of their kids, wipe the butts, do the things, blah, 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 blah. That's not epic and legendary. And so as a result, I think that has a big part of the mental health crisis that men are facing today, is if we're not epic, if we're not legendary, then who are we? And what are we worth? And we systemically and systematically denigrate any of the other side of what life, connection, interactions, can be, because we see them as less than. They're feminine. They're this. They're soft. And so as being able to be seen in other ways is something that I think is missing deeply from our male experience. That's a lot of an answer. I hope that's all right.
We had Eve Rodsky on recently, and she at one point brought up the fact that men have really missed out on how many of the mundane tasks that it takes to manage a home, which includes parenting, on a more regular basis, have always been shaped as kind of crappy, and that really those tasks where you're at home, and again, I want to stress this: most listeners and all of us here, we work too, but
Yeah.
But when I say at home, that means you're present at home. Your mind is there. You're purposeful, and that there has been a kind of like a way in which society has made those tasks sound garbage. But
Yeah.
that, as she said, that brings out our humanity. When we are, changing diapers, when we are in the backyard tossing a ball, with our kids, when we are, doing some housework so our partner can relax and decompress, and that a lot of that is a disconnect between what you were saying, how our success is shaped in society. And, this, I mean, that's this for what you're sharing, like growing up, if you do not cry, where I grew up, you do not cry. You were done. You were going to be bullied for the rest of your education. You were done. You don't do it. And you don't talk about feelings. And I remember specific conversations with family members where you're like, look, people don't care about your feelings. Don't ever talk about your problems. People don't care about your problems. Make them laugh, talk about sports, be lighthearted, talk about them. Like, don't ever, ever talk about, problems that you're facing. They don't care. And it's interesting because it works. You build a great friend group. You always have fun, but like you become, I brought this up with Eve, like a tea kettle. Like you don't ever share anything with anybody because you're trained not to talk to your spouse about it either. And eventually, you go. So I'm glad that you brought up kind of like both through metaphors, through literature, just all these ways in which men are, naturally told to suppress what should be kind of natural conversations throughout their journey in life, and how that has an impact on our overall mental health.
Massively. Absolutely. It's really important.
Hey there, podcast fam. We'd love to hear from you. Please take this moment to rate and subscribe to our podcast. Your feedback fuels our passion to bring you more engaging content. And please text this episode to your friends. It's your support that can help us grow. Now back to the show.
If I could add one more layer to the I guess analogy here between sort of men's stories and the hero's journey. So, the three of us, Jason, come from, education and also personal finance as well. Dr. Ross, a financial therapist, right, and teaches. So, Brian has a long history of expanding access to personal finance education, as well as teaching personal finance to students. And I kind of see this as the concept of diversifying. When we invest, it's pretty foolhardy to try to pick one stock and just hope that one's going to go to the moon. That one stock, here's the analogy. That one stock is the hero's journey. Being the only pattern that men's lives can or should fit into. We're picking one stock and hoping that one's going to go to the moon. But there are a million other stocks out there, and there are also, communities, i.e., index funds, mutual funds, where all these stories are coming together and enriching, the actually the returns of each individual stock in there. You're far better off having sort of joined a community, having shared varying perspectives and stories than trying to pigeonhole yourself into one version of men's stories. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. I love that analogy. I would add one thing to it, though. In this culture around like men in our current stories, you mentioned, picking one stock. That's even more empowered than we are today, right? Like men aren't even able to pick that one stock because it's foisted upon them, right? And so otherwise the analogy is, I love that. That's great. And, it's interesting because it is just another stock. I don't think there's anything wrong with the story in and of itself, but it doesn't tell the whole story, and it pushes other stories away, right? So, in the hero's journey, when the hero is battling the dragon and like doing amazing things with the sword, maybe at most you get a montage or a flashback about how he learned how to use the sword. But there was 20 years of practice before all of this, or maybe magic that all of a sudden he's a great swordsman, right? But that's not how it works in life, right? We have to have the discipline and the practice and the chop wood, carry water sort of experience that makes life rich and whole, which is also, to go with your analogy, you wouldn't pick a community or a stock or any sort of things without doing some research or talking to someone or getting some mentorship or getting some help. All of that is really powerful, and yet we're not encouraged to do that. And we know how important it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can you elaborate on some of the strategies or programs that you've found most helpful in facilitating positive change, towards this more, I guess, wide array of men's stories?
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking about this, and when I started Journeymen, I was very excited about the strategies and the techniques and the things that I'd created. I pat myself on the back for that. And I forgot the fact that I have an entire master's degree focused on the importance of group development and social communities and things like that. And so I was so excited about doing all these strategies and following the curriculum and all of that. And back in my mind, I must have known, because I pretty much only offer groups. I do have some individual coaching going, but I really run, the idea is the coaching groups. And without fail, when I have exit interviews with my guys who've gone through the program and I ask, what are some of the things that were most helpful for you? I would say 10 out of 10, at least in the top 3 list, well, this group of guys that I met with every time. So, it's funny because I've never marketed it as that. Until recently, I've never, really talked about the importance of that group, although, at my core, I know how important and powerful that is. So, I love your question. I would say single-handedly, one of the best thing would be a program. Right? Mine if it works for you, but there are tons of men's programs out there. And the idea of not having to do it alone is something that I think is absolutely foundational. There are men's groups, there's men's mentorship, there's men's supervision, there's men's programs, men's therapy, there's a lot, it may be because of the algorithm, but I'm seeing more and more of those things today. And there are resources for men nationally, smaller programs like mine, things like that. So I would say that's the first piece. The next piece around just like specific strategies would be about becoming more aware of the possibility of other stories, becoming more aware of what's meaningful and valuable to who you are and what you want in life. Like another piece about our culture, especially today, is we're encouraged to essentially swipe away from anything challenging, meaningful, hard, uncomfortable, all these things. And, we've got distractors, just, distraction devices in our pockets everywhere. And so if we stop and get to know ourselves a little bit, a lot of things change. What do we care about? What do we believe in? What do we value? What do we really want? I think those are the first questions that I always talk to guys about.
Can you discuss the importance of, I guess, fostering emotional intelligence in men, and how that might contribute to their overall mental well-being?
Yeah, it's interesting, emotional intelligence as a concept, it's so interesting because it's new as a concept, which is relatively, I mean, I don't know when I forget when the book came out, but relatively new. And so it's interesting that we had to create a construct to talk about knowing how you feel. and knowing how others feel and being aware interpersonally. I mean, we had to like write a book about it. We had to like, but the importance of it, I don't think could ever be understated. Right. It's almost trite, but I think for a reason that men, feel, mad and bad. Right. Like mad, bad, and glad, I think is the way that people talk about it. That's the emotions that are
Bad,
available
glad,
in
and
a,
bad.
yeah, those are the emotions that are available and acceptable for men to have. And the truth is, for us, the 4 of us, and for any of your listeners, clearly that is a broad statement. Right. And so if you're a guy listening, you're like, well, no, I also feel, yeah, of course, we're all individuals and that happens. But if we really think about it, like, mad, bad, and glad are umbrella terms, right? We might also feel jealous, but that makes us mad. We might also feel sad, but that makes us feel bad. Like these are things that we miss. And so, how important it is it, I think it's dire, right? Like the ability to know, the simplest thing is, right? I work in the basement. Here's my basement office. I go upstairs and I see someone in my family and they do something, right? If I don't know how it makes me feel, I'm going to react. I'm just going to react. Instead of stopping, responding, and likely if I react, I'm going to react according to a pattern of behavior, according to a past narrative or story that I've been doing on some level in some way for most of my life, that I learned from, family culture models, stories, movies, whatever it is. And all of a sudden we're all back on sort of autopilot. You do this, I yell, you get quiet, we do this, and we pass it on and on and on and on and on. Right. And so being able to stop, slow things down, respond rather than react, all of that comes from having learning the awareness of being able to say, what am I feeling? Like, how do I, like, what's happening doing inside of me? right? And so, in the Journeymen program, we connect to ourselves and then to the people we purport to love the most, because we have to know what's going on in here first.
What are some of the coping mechanisms that men use?
The successful and healthful ones, or the typical ones?
I would say typical first, and then successful,
Yeah.
helpful.
I had this conversation with one of my clients yesterday because we were talking about dissociation. And, dissociation in a clinical therapeutic sense, or a therapy sense, or in a diagnostic sense, is certainly a bigger, scarier term than the way I'm using it right now. But it still works, right? I think what the main coping mechanism that many men use is some form of dissociation, whether it's substances, or scrolling on Instagram for 2 hours and then going, oh my gosh, it's 2 hours later, or playing video games, or, any number of things. And all of these things in and of themselves aren't bad. I want to be really clear on that, right? Like, if I go play video games, that's fine. If I go have a drink, that's fine. If I'm a huge fan of the Marvel universe, and so I certainly delve into that and I'll watch that. But if I watch it and then, without even thinking, put on another thing, and then, I'm just dissociating from any of my own internal experiences, and I'm distancing from any of my external, relationships and things like that. So I think dissociation and distancing is an umbrella term for many of the coping strategies that a lot of men use. And it can be through watching or playing. It can be through substances. It can be through swiping and wasting time online. So many different ways of, I'm going to go take care of this instead of dealing with my crap. And that can be, that's a big umbrella concept, because it can be, I'm going to yell at my kids so that they listen, right? Rather than kind of dealing with the crap that is between us, right? It is like this reactivity. So it's a spectrum. It's either being reactive and explosive, or pulled in and isolated, right? And neither of those create connections, which, as we mentioned earlier, are pretty essential for human relations. So that's the sort of more typical coping mechanisms that I see. And I think ones that are, I think it will track and make sense. The ones that I teach that are more healthful are around slowing and being connected and being intentional. And so, my favorite show in the MCU is Loki. So when that came out, it was a new episode came out every Wednesday. And so I was intentional. Yeah, I'm going to stay up later than usual. And I'm going to watch that show. And then I'll probably watch all the critical, videos about it. So what am I going to do? On Thursday, I'm going to start a little later. I'm going to be a little more aware. I'm going to try to get things done before I do that. I'm going to be intentional about all right, I'm going to go zone out and watch my show, rather than, because I have guys all the time who say, I wanted to do this thing, but I was so tired. I was like, okay, so what did you do? Well, I wound up on the couch watching shows until, midnight. Oh, and did you feel relaxed and nourished after that? No. Right? If I'm like, if you're too tired to do the things you say you need to do, go to bed. Do something nourishing. Do something that fills you up, and make that choice. Make it intentional. And if you're going to be intentional about loafing around, that's fine. Be intentional about it.
So, Jason, you've talked a lot about the roles, but the need for relationships, social connections, and how that helps men in their mental health. Right? How can we cultivate? How can we build these supportive networks?
That's the question, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, that is the question. I think, first for me, and I mentioned it before, the first is being aware of that, right? Like I mentioned with my client who was like, yeah, I had a great time with all my buddies. Okay. But if you were having trouble with your wife, would you sit and talk to your buddies about it? Would you cry with them? Would you talk with them? So, how can we start to do these things? I hear a lot from guys who, when I talk like this, will say, well, but I got friends, right? So my challenge to men is, okay, how often and how able are you able to say, let's talk about something deep and meaningful and real? And not that it always has to be that way. I'm not trying to get into that. But like, if shit's going down, I don't know if I can swear here. I hope that's okay. But if stuff's going down, if you need to edit it, if stuff's going down in your life, can you call a friend and be real with them? Or if you're a friend and you see a guy screwing up, if you see a guy making mistakes, can you call them out on it and being like, hey, what are you doing here? Right. So to me, we actually, many men, not all, but many men actually do have some connections. So I want to challenge them to deepen them, to be aware of that and to say like, hey, I need some help. Right. And it going back to sort of social cultural pressures. Right. I have a close friend of mine who's a brother. I mean, we've spent the last 30 New Years together. We've known each other since we were 12, and we've been almost closest friends since that time. He's a very well, emotional person. He was a teacher. He's done all things. I'm, to who I am. I do what I do. And even then, it took us into our 30s to be able to say, I love you to one another. Right. And even then it was, I love you, brother. I love you, man. Right. It had to be somehow, I mean, look at your reactions, right? It had to be something that made us smile.
Your voice
afterwards.
deepened a little bit too.
Yeah. Like, and then it took us, until then to do that. And now I'm in my late 40s. And only in the last couple of years have I been able to say, like, I love you. Like, I really care about you. And if you need anything, I'll be there. Right. And we've talked about it. We go, once we spend New Year's together, once a year we go camping, and we it used to be, the two of us doing the same kind of things that I mentioned earlier. And then last couple of years, it was like, let's go camping and deal with our lives together, because that's what we do. And so taking action, I think, as therapists and coaches, we like acronyms. And so I, of course, have one. And my favorite, it's sort of the foundation to your your question around what can men do, is the 4 things that spell men's. I do men's work. And I talk about the in and the out breath of men's work. So the in breath, so each of the 4 letters in men's, there's an in breath and an out breath. So, in breath is taking a stock of who we are and where we're at. The out breath is understanding our context and the people around us, right? So the M is being mindful, right? And not necessarily mindful meditation. I do that and I teach that, but I think I write it as 2 words, mindful, which means being full of what's going on for you, being understanding of your own mind and heart, frankly, like what's your inner world like, being mindful. And then that's for you. And then again, the out breath is, we can't read minds, but taking into context, where are the people around us at? Like, are they upset? Are they, what's going on for them? Right. The E is for experience. It's the action piece. I think as men, we have to take action, right? Like, we have to do something. If we're aware of what's going on for ourselves, let's do something about it. Right. Similarly, the out breath, right? If my son who's anxious, I say, hey, I can notice that. Maybe do you want to go work out? Do you have time to go do a workout? That'll help. I can be connected in a way that I can suggest, or I can be part of taking action with the people around me. The N is nourishment. I'm a cook. Also, I have my other life. I've done a lot of entrepreneurial work in the food world, and so I use that metaphor a lot. But what fills us up? Literally with food, or spiritually, or whatever, what fills us up, what nourishes us? First my in breath, and then the out breath, right? And then the last one, I'm really glad that men's is spelled the way it is, because the S has to be at the end. You can't get to the S without doing the MEN first, because the S is social action, social activism, right? Once you're mindful, once you take action and you're experiential, once you're filled up and nourished, I think as men, we have a responsibility to go do other things. We have a responsibility to connect with others, to fix the world, right? In my mind, a connected father is a social activist. And so, again, these are long answers to your questions, but I think these are the things that we can do. We can get involved. We can join community programs. We can be more present at home. I have a PDF I can share with you all of the 10 fastest ways that fathers can connect with their kids. And if you did all 10 every day, it's less than 12 minutes. I mean, yeah, I'll send you the link. I'll
Please send that. Yeah. For our listeners, we will include that in the show notes.
Yeah, it's a good segue too, because the other thing I was hoping to ask you about today was basically habits and practices around mindfulness and self-care that you recommend for men. I know it's not, there's no switch that we can flip as men to all of a sudden be, doing MENS work perfectly. Right. That doesn't exist, but as we build towards it, what are the things, what are the habits we can be building?
Yeah. I think the easier said than done thing would be to slow down, but I'll give a better example and a more practical one for you. There actually, I think this idea of mindfulness gets a big, we talk about, everyone's talking, it's sort of the idea du jour or the decade, I guess. It's been around for a while, but, it doesn't have to be big and deep and spiritual and all of these things. It's really about like being aware of what's going on. So if you're eating dinner with your family, put your phone away. If you're getting dressed in the morning, get dressed, like be present to that each and every time. There's a practice that I teach all of the guys, and I can do it. I can tell it to you in minutes. So I'll share it with you. Is that it's a mindfulness practice that I developed with my son. We call it the 3 wonders. And I like words. I said I make mindful into 2 words, and wonderful 2 words. Wonderful, full of wonder. Right. So I was explaining that to my son when he was about 11 or 12, and he was like, wow, that's cool. That's better than just wonderful. He's like, but what's it mean? And I was like, all right, well, what does being full of wonder mean? Right. And again, it goes back to the everyday adventures and not the hero's journey. It's like, how do you become full of wonder when you're like doing the dishes, or when you're in these everyday things? And we mentioned that we talked about it, and being full of wonder is really being curious and being sort of awe-inspired, awed. Like, and again, that's hard to be awed when you're doing the dishes, unless you really think about it. Unless you're like, oh, I just fed and nourished my family. Like, without that, we'd be dead. Damn, that's kind of awe-inspiring. Like, I just had the privilege of like sustaining life with my kids, right? So so he looked at me and he was like, yeah, that's pretty awesome. Like, how do we become full of wonder? And we came up with a practice that is literally 3 minutes or less. So I teach all my guys to do this, to try to do it as often as possible, really. First step is presence, right? So you can take a clock, you can time it even, and just for a minute, go through all 5 of your senses. Be present to this moment. What are you feeling with your body? What are you smelling? What are you tasting? What are you hearing? What are you seeing? That's all 5, right? Just go through those. That takes, if you took 3 seconds each, that takes 15 seconds, right? Just to be aware of your present with your senses. Then the next step 2, would be curious. So presence, curiosity. Pick one of those senses and engender some curiosity about it. So right now in our talking, I'm hearing something going on upstairs. That's what I'm hearing. So if I did presence, that would be something. And I'd say, all right, like, no one's supposed to be home. I wonder what's upstairs. I'm curious about that. Did my wife come home? Well, I live in the country. I'm sure it's nothing. And my wife maybe came home early, or maybe my dog's gotten into something. Something's going on. I'm going to be curious about that. I'm going to engender curiosity. And then the last thing.
The Modern Husbands podcast isn't turning into a true crime thing.
Right.
No, I'm sure it's fine.
Just happened. It just happened to my parents' neighbor. Like, he was working out in the basement and was curious about the noises. Was his wife home? And it was someone breaking in.
Yikes. Well, I hope he
Luckily,
was
like
all
they
right.
caught him, everything's all right. But like,
Okay. Oy. Well, better to be curious than not and avoidant. Let's go for that. Oh, I hear something, So, but then the third step is, and arguably maybe the most important, but not because you have to have the first two, is gratitude. Right? So I'm present to my senses. I'm curious about one of them. And now I want you to find some way to feel gratitude for that sense you were just curious about. So I'm hearing something upstairs. And as we're talking, it does sound like it's my dog, right? Like it does sound like that. So I can be grateful for the presence of my dog. Like it can be, more often than not, my dog is like, I call her my therapy dog because she comes down here and she'll sit on my feet while I'm here. So I can have some moments where I'm like really grateful for the presence of my canine friend. And I'd encourage your listeners, I'd encourage you all to try like presence, curiosity, gratitude. And it's less than it took me 3.5 minutes to tell you. And it's a practice that, in doing that, it slows everything down. And by slowing down and engendering a little bit of wonder in our everyday lives, do it before you have to clean the toilets, right? It's still going to be a shitty job, but it'll make it a little easier for you to get through it and maybe a little more meaningful.
First of all, kudos to that pun. So
we're all about dad jokes.
Oh, I love it. As you were describing that process, right, where you want to be present first, right? That's essential. And then be curious and then be grateful. Well, I feel like that, throughout my marriage, we've been married for almost 22 years now. We both work, we have 3 kids, and so you're always kind of like on the go. And even in the moments where you're home, your mind isn't always there because you have so many other responsibilities. And it's hard to connect with your spouse when your mind is focused on those responsibilities, your spouse's mind is focused on responsibilities. And I can reflect on, long periods of time where I was the issue here, where I wasn't simply present. I didn't go through just the exercise of taking a step back, recognizing through the different senses that I'm here right now, and then just simply being curious about my spouse's day, asking my wife, how did the day go? And when I say that, not in a it's not a rhetorical question, right? It's not one of these habits where people walk through the door, how was your day? Because you feel like it's an obligatory question, but truly try to be curious and understand it, and then figure out, like, did they have a bad day? If so, what do they need? Do they need support? Do they need solutions? Do they need space? And then, show some gratitude for whatever that spouse is giving you in your relationship. Just going through those 3 things might take maybe 5 minutes, but I feel like that can have a pretty significant impact on your relationship with your spouse. And I regret not doing that when times were really tough and I was really busy, because even with that lifestyle, you can find 5 minutes and that would enhance a relationship.
Yes, 100%. And, I challenge people when you're right, this lifestyle of go, 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 this goes back to what we said earlier about what's meaningful, what's valuable, what's all these things. Like, go, 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 go to what? Right? I tell guys all the time, like, if you don't have 3 minutes to practice this, honestly, we have more important things to work on, right, in your life. Like yes, there are certainly things that have to happen. But if you're 3 minutes late to work, if the kids are 3 minutes late to school, if, et cetera, things are going to be okay. We have this false sense of emergency and urgency that drives us in a way that is incredibly unhealthy as far as I'm concerned. And if we slow it down, that goes back to being an activist, right? If I slow things down, I'm literally changing the way our culture, even if I'm just talking about my family culture, right? If we got to go, we got to go. And I say, wait, hold on. Like, we can be a few minutes late. This is really important. I need to look you in the eyes for a minute. Or I need to give you a hug because I feel like we're missing something. Like what you described with your wife, think about also how that would change if we're reactive to our kids. How do we stop for a minute and get curious? Like, they're being whatever, they're misbehaving, whatever they are. Well, that's a language. That they're communicating something. And if we just go back to automatic reactivity, like we mentioned earlier, well, then we're just following the same old story, right? They misbehave, we yell, they're, beaten into submission, frankly, by our rapid paced reactivity. And we're not connecting. We're not spending time to go, what's really going on here?
Where can listeners learn more about your work, Dr. Frishman?
Well, I'm on, Facebook, LinkedIn mostly, and Instagram. But I think the best would be my website is journeymanfoundation.com. And, as much as I would love to be a massive organization and all these things, it's me. And so if someone emails me at jason@nourishedconnection.com, they're going to get me. And I love talking to people and connecting with guys, even, just to connect and hear what people are doing. We have I have a group that's starting pretty soon that I'm going to be running in the Journeymen program. So if people are interested in that, or if they just want to hear, at my website, I have a blog where I've written a bunch of things on this topic, and I'll soon be listing all the podcasts I've been on if people are interested in hearing more. But the website and email are probably the best, most direct ways to get in touch.
Well, we will be sure to include that in our show notes. For our listeners, you have a significant following in your Facebook group. And we really appreciate your time here. It was full of actionable advice to help men and husbands. And I know I learned a lot.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I love talking about this, and it's great to meet you all.
A special thanks to our guest and, of course, to all of our listeners. Don't forget to click subscribe wherever you download your podcast, give us a rating, and share the Modern Husbands podcast with others. Doing so goes a long way in growing our reach. And join your fellow modern husbands and have links to our podcasts, articles, and other resources to manage money in the home as a team sent to your inbox every 2 weeks by subscribing to our newsletter at modernhusbands.com. Until next time, be well.